When my husband inherited property, my mill said, just remember it stays in our family, not hers. I wasn't even in the room, but my SIL repeated it later, laughing. So I waited until we renovated. Every brick, every tile, every piece was chosen by me. Then I had our family name engraved in stone above the door, my maiden name. When she saw it, she asked, "Why that name?" I smiled. Because this home was built on love, not inheritance. I was standing in the half-finished kitchen, drywall dust on my jeans, when my sister-in-law's words replayed in my head so clearly it felt like she was right behind me. Just remember, it stays in our family, not hers. She'd said it while laughing. That was the part that burned. I wasn't even in the damn room when it happened. I was upstairs trying to figure out which light fixture made the most sense over the sink. Meanwhile, downstairs, my mother-in-law was talking to my husband like I didn't exist. In our family, not hers. The hers being me. And my SIL, who has always had this smug, know-it-all smirk, repeated it later as if it were some hilarious family joke I just needed to get over. But I didn't get over it. I couldn't, because we had just inherited this house, my husband's childhood home, after his grandfather passed. And the understanding from the very beginning was that we would fix it up, live in it, make it ours. Ours. I had spent weeks measuring rooms, making lists, scraping old wallpaper, and sanding cabinets. I had poured so much of myself into the house already, even before renovations officially started. So hearing that comment, that this house wasn't mine, that I was some outsider claiming space where I didn't belong, it cracked something in me. Something deep and quiet. Something that didn't break loudly, but slowly, the way a foundation shifts under pressure. I didn't say anything to my mill when I heard about it. I didn't even tell my husband right away. I just tucked it somewhere inside me, where the bitterness settled like cold stone. And then, over the next few weeks, I started making choices. Small ones at first, like the exact shade of the exterior trim. Then bigger ones, like the tile pattern in the entryway, the hardware on every cabinet, the finish on the stairs. My husband trusted my taste, and he was busy with probate paperwork and work deadlines, so the decisions naturally fell to me. Every brick we replaced. Every wall we rebuilt. Every piece of this home, I chose it. And it didn't feel petty. It felt necessary. Like reclaiming space someone had tried to quietly steal from me. Then one day, while walking through a stone yard, I saw it. A long limestone slab with a smooth front face and a natural textured edge. It was meant for signage, farm entrances, big front gates, things meant to last. Something in my chest tightened. That old quiet crack inside me widened. And I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I ordered it without telling anyone. I gave them the exact engraving. My engraving. When the contractors installed it above the entryway, the house didn't just look different, it felt different. Like it had shed its old skin. Like it finally belonged to the people who lived there now, not the ghosts of whoever claimed it before. The day my mill showed up unannounced, I knew we were heading toward something big. I saw her face twist as she stepped onto the porch, her eyes narrowing at the stone above the door. Why that name?" she asked, her voice sharp and already accusing. I wiped my hands on my jeans, met her stare, and finally said the truth that had been sitting in me for months. "Because this home was built on love," I told her, "not inheritance." The look she gave me then, shock, confusion, something almost like fear, was just the beginning. Because she had no idea what else she'd set in motion. Before any of this happened, before the stone, before the whispering and the digs and the inheritance nonsense, I honestly thought my husband's family liked me. Not loved me. Let's be real, they're not that kind of warm. But at least tolerated me in that basic, polite way people do when they know you're going to be around for decades. When I first met his mom, she hugged me stiffly, the kind of hug where her upper arms moved but nothing else did. His sister gave me that once-over look women give when they're sizing someone up. I chalked it up to nerves. I wanted so badly to keep the peace. My own family is close, loud, chaotic. His was quiet, structured, rule-based. I figured I could adapt, and for a while things were fine. Holidays were a little tense. Mill would comment on how I cooked things differently. And SIL sometimes acted like my opinions were cute little inconveniences, but nothing that seemed worth fighting over. I thought that was just their way. Then his grandfather got sick. This man, my husband's grandfather, was the only one in the family who treated me like I wasn't some temporary outsider. He listened to me. He asked real questions. He called me kiddo. When he passed, it shook my husband hard. And when it turned out he'd left the house to my husband in his will, my Mill and SIL got weird. Not openly hostile, not yet. But cold, tight, snapping at small things. Mill made comments like, "Your grandfather always favored you." And SIL kept asking, "So what exactly are you two planning to do with it?" In that tone that made it clear she thought the answer should include her. The house itself wasn't some mansion or massive estate. It was an old 3-bedroom in Richmond, Virginia, the kind with creaky floors and walls that needed more work than anyone wanted to admit. It had great bones, though, and an even better view of the neighborhood. My husband had so many childhood memories in that place, and I honestly fell a little in love with the idea of restoring it. My husband and I agreed early. We wanted to raise our future kids there, build our own traditions, make it ours. But from the moment we said we were moving in, the energy shifted. Mill kept reminding us that it was the family home, and SIL made little jokes about keeping her old room untouched for when she needed a place to stay. I laughed back then. I thought it was harmless. Then came the comment, the one I didn't even hear myself. It happened a few days after demos started. My husband had taken a break to talk with his mom, and I'd gone upstairs to measure for cabinets. SIL came up later, leaned against the doorframe, smirking like she'd been waiting to drop a bomb. "You should have heard Mom downstairs," she said. She told him, "Just remember, it stays in our family. Not hers." She said it like she was telling me the weather, like it was nothing, like it wasn't a knife dressed up as a joke. My stomach dropped, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of reacting. I just kept writing measurements and nodded like it didn't hurt. But it did. It dug in deeper than any of their other comments ever had, because I realized something in that moment. No matter how much I had helped, how much work I put in, how much I loved my husband, they still saw me as temporary, as an intruder in a house they didn't even own. That was the day the quiet resentment started turning into something sharper, colder, focused, not revenge yet, just awareness. The kind that changes everything that comes after. After that comment, everything shifted, not loudly. Not in any way someone could point to and say, "See, that's the problem." It was quieter than that. A slow erosion. Like they thought if they wore me down grain by grain, I'd eventually crumble and leave the picture entirely. The next few weeks of renovations were supposed to be exciting. My husband and I had planned to pick out materials together, argue over paint colors in a cute way, make memories. Instead, I ended up doing 90% of it alone because he was drowning in work and grief. I didn't blame him, not even a little. He was handling everything he could. But his family, they swooped in during his vulnerable moments. Mill kept stopping by unannounced, even though we'd told her the house was a construction zone. Every time she came, she'd walk around with that pinched expression, the one where her lips looked like they were trying to retreat into her face. She'd say things like, "Your grandfather would hate seeing his house like this," or, "I just hope you two don't overmodernize it. It needs to stay true to the family." The family. The way she said it was always pointed. And SIL, God, she was worse. She started acting like the renovations were some group project she'd been assigned to. She'd wander around giving input nobody asked for, touching samples I had laid out, making suggestions that sounded more like orders. "You're not doing the kitchen in white, right? Mom hates white kitchens. You moved that wall, that was Dad's favorite part of the house. You're picking the fixtures, isn't that more of a family decision?" A family decision. Like I wasn't part of that category. Every day felt like walking through sludge. They kept chipping away at me in these tiny, passive-aggressive cuts. And the worst part was how they always acted innocent, like I was imagining the tone, like everything they said was perfectly normal. My husband didn't hear most of it, and I didn't always tell him. Not because I was hiding it, but because I didn't want to add more weight onto his shoulders. He was already stretched thin. He kept saying, "They're just stressed. They'll get better." But they didn't. They sharpened. The turning point came when we were choosing the flooring, probably the biggest design choice in the entire house. I had spent days researching, comparing samples, imagining how light would hit the wood in the mornings. I picked something warm, subtle, something that made the whole house feel alive again. When the contractors were about to install it, Mills showed up and said, right in front of them, "Oh no, that's not the right one. My son prefers darker wood." And she said it with such authority that the contractors actually paused. I stared at her, stunned. My husband wasn't even there. She was just making decisions in his name, claiming him like a shield. I told the contractors to continue, firmly, and Mill had the gall to say, "You're being emotional. This is a family house, we all get a say." That was the moment a cold clarity settled in me. This wasn't insecurity. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was territory. This was them trying to stake a claim, not on the house, but on my marriage, my place, my future. By the time the house started to look like a home, I felt like I was living in a battleground they didn't even admit they'd created. And every single thing I chose, every tile and brick and detail, wasn't just design anymore. It was resistance. A reminder that I existed, that I wasn't leaving, that their little club of exclusivity didn't control this narrative, but I didn't expect how far they'd go, or how deep the first major betrayal would cut. The betrayal didn't come in fire or screaming or some dramatic showdown. It came quietly, just like everything else they did. Quiet but devastating. It happened 2 days before the final inspection. We were exhausted, covered in paint half the time, running on takeout and adrenaline. The house was finally looking like a place we could live in, not just a project. My husband was actually smiling again. I was starting to think maybe we'd survived his family's interference. Then the letter came. At first, I thought it was just more contractor paperwork or something from the city. The envelope was thin, white, official-looking. My husband wasn't home yet, so I opened it, expecting invoices or codes. Instead, my stomach dropped so hard I thought I might throw up. It was a petition for a property partition, filed by my mother-in-law, co-signed by my sister-in-law. I had to read it 3 times because my brain refused to process it. In simple terms, they were trying to legally split the house into portions and force us to buy them out for the value they believed they were entitled to. They claimed the house was part of a multi-generational family inheritance and that they were co-beneficiaries by tradition. Tradition. Not law, not reality, not the will, just tradition. And they were trying to use that made-up family tradition to wedge themselves into legal ownership of the property, even though the house had been left solely to my husband. Explicitly, by name. They didn't even tell him they were filing it. They didn't discuss it. They just went behind his back and tried to take part of his inheritance by force, because they couldn't stand the idea that I would live there. The part that made my hands shake wasn't the paperwork. It wasn't the legal language or the audacity or even the betrayal itself. It was the date. They filed it 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks while Mills smiled at my husband and asked about his work. 3 weeks while SIL pretended she just loved seeing the progress. 3 weeks while they walked through the house and criticized my choices like they were doing me some kind of favor. 3 weeks of lies. I felt the anger hit me in waves, cold, then hot, then freezing again. I sat on the unfinished stairs and stared at the papers until the words blurred. By the time my husband got home, I had rehearsed a dozen ways to tell him. But when he walked in and saw my face, I didn't have to say anything. I just handed him the envelope. He read it once, twice. His face drained completely of color. "No," he said quietly, shaking his head. "No. They wouldn't do this." But they had. They absolutely had. He tried calling his mother, she didn't answer. He tried his sister, straight to voicemail. It was coordinated. Planned. They knew exactly what they were doing. I watched the realization settle into him like a weight. This wasn't meddling or stress or harsh words. This was calculated, intentionally cruel, designed to hurt us both. But the part that broke him and then broke me was when he finally whispered, "They did this because of you." It wasn't accusation. It was devastation. That night, he didn't sleep. He paced the living room, reading the papers again and again. I lay awake listening to the creaks of the house we'd been building together and felt something shift inside me. Up until then, I'd been reacting, defending myself, trying not to escalate things. But this was war. And they had no idea who they were dealing with. Everything that came next, the planning, the second twist, the final revenge, it all started with that envelope. For the first time since the renovations began, the house felt hostile. Not because of the walls or the tools scattered everywhere, but because of that thin stack of legal papers sitting on our kitchen island like a loaded weapon. My husband was broken. Not angry, broken. And that did something to me I can't fully explain. It snapped whatever was left of my patience clean in half. For days after the petition arrived, he kept trying to make sense of it. He reread the will. He called the lawyer who handled his grandfather's estate. He talked to friends, coworkers, anyone who knew even a shred about property law. He was hoping, desperately, for someone to tell him this wasn't real, that it was fixable, that it was some kind of misunderstanding. But everyone said the same thing. Yes, the filing was garbage. Yes, it was legally flimsy, but we still had to fight it. And that meant time, money, stress, court dates, conflict, exactly what his mother and sister wanted. They didn't need to win, they just needed to bleed us dry. That's when something inside me hardened. Not angry, not emotional, just focused. They wanted to play dirty? Fine. I could dig trenches they didn't even know existed. The first thing I did was call my family's attorney. This man doesn't play. He's handled enough ugly divorces, business disputes, and family implosions to know every sneaky trick in the book. I sent him everything, will documents, evaluations, the petition, even text messages where Mill and SIL implied the house was a family asset. He called me back the next morning. "Do not worry," he said calmly. "They filed something they can't defend. We're going to dismantle this." And then he asked me something I didn't expect. "Are you looking for a clean win, or a decisive win?" I didn't even hesitate. Decisive, because a clean win would mean the case gets dismissed, and everyone pretends it never happened. A decisive win would mean never having to deal with this crap again. Over the next week, gears started turning, legal ones, strategic ones, emotional ones. My husband was still reeling, but once he saw I wasn't backing down, he started to stand up straighter too. I gathered every screenshot, every message, every rude comment. Every time Mill or SIL had implied ownership, guilted us, or made some weird family claim. I printed them out and organized them like case evidence. Then I went further. I started documenting every renovation expense, every flooring receipt, every tile, every contractor bill, with my name attached. Because while the property itself belonged to my husband, all the upgrades, those were marital contributions. And marital contributions change everything in court. But the biggest part of my plan wasn't legal at all. It was psychological. Mill and SIL operated on smugness, that inflated sense of importance. They truly believed they were untouchable, that family loyalty was some kind of shield. They thought I was soft, that I wanted peace more than justice, that I'd stay quiet because I didn't want to be the problem. So I let them believe it. I let them think the petition scared us into silence. I let SIL keep sending passive-aggressive texts about hoping the house is coming together. I let Mill leave voicemails pretending nothing was wrong. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, I was building something slow and airtight, something they wouldn't see coming until it crushed them. But halfway through the planning, something unexpected happened. Something that didn't just change the strategy, it changed the whole playing field. A twist I never saw coming. The twist hit on a Thursday morning, right when I thought I had everything under control. I was sitting at the dining table. Well, what would be the dining table once we bought actual furniture, going through receipts and emails for our lawyer. My husband had left early for a meeting. The house was quiet except for the hum of a box fan in the hallway. Then someone knocked on the door, not a polite tap, a firm, official-sounding knock. When I opened it, a man in a blazer held out a folder with my husband's last name printed across the top. I recognized the style immediately, legal documents. My stomach went tight. "Are you Mrs. Yes?" He handed me the folder. "These need to be delivered directly." As soon as he left, I closed the door, leaned against it, and opened the packet. And for a second, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't from Mill, not SIL, not even their lawyer. It was from my husband's estranged father, a man I had never met, a man my husband hadn't spoken to in 14 years, a man everyone in the family pretended didn't exist. Inside was a notice of intent to claim stake in the property as a direct descendant of the previous generation, citing something called equitable contribution to familial property maintenance. I had no idea what that meant, legally speaking, but the explanation letter, written in a cold, matter-of-fact tone, made one thing clear. He believed he was entitled to the house, and he wanted it sold. Immediately. My hands started shaking, but not from fear, from rage, from disbelief, from the sinking, nauseating realization that Mill and SIL weren't acting alone. That this whole time, while they sneered and smirked and tried to corner us, someone else had been watching from the shadows. Someone they had lied about. Someone they had erased from every family story. Someone who suddenly had opinions about property he hadn't lived in for decades. But the more I read, the stranger it got. He referenced conversations, recent conversations, with family members involved in current decisions. And right there, tucked between legal jargon and self-righteous posturing, was the sentence that changed everything. Per discussions with your mother and sister, it is clear the property is intended to remain within my bloodline. Therefore, I expect cooperation in liquidating the asset. I felt my vision tunnel. Mill and SIL hadn't just filed their own petition. They had gone behind my husband's back and dragged in the one person who could hurt him more than they already had. When my husband came home later, I didn't say anything at first. I just handed him the packet the same way I had with the first one. He opened it. He read it. And I watched the color drain from his face even faster than before. My father, he whispered, like the words themselves cut his throat. Why would they talk to him? He sat down on the floor, not a chair, the floor, like everything inside him had been yanked out at once. He told me what he'd never fully explained before, how his father had bylaid on the family when he was 14. How Mill had built an entire narrative around being the wronged parent. How she'd sworn he was toxic, unreliable, dangerous to their stability. And yet now she'd welcomed him back, secretly, just to use him against her own son. The betrayal was bigger than property. It was bigger than inheritance. It was a crack in the foundation of his entire reality. He looked up at me with this hollow, stunned expression and said something that made the hair on my arms stand up. They're not trying to keep the house. They're trying to break us. And that was the moment the tone of everything changed. This wasn't about real estate anymore. This was psychological warfare. This was generational cruelty dressed up as family unity. This was the kind of darkness people don't talk about because it sounds unbelievable. But I believed it. And I was done staying quiet, because now I knew Mill and SIL weren't just petty. They weren't just jealous. They weren't just meddling. They were strategic. They were coordinated. And they were willing to weaponize the one man my husband had spent his entire adult life recovering from. And that meant my retaliation, it had to be bigger, sharper, final. But before I could make a move, I had to understand one thing first. Why? Why his mother would do something this cruel, this intentionally destabilizing to her own child. And the truth, when it came out, it was colder than anything I expected. I thought I understood spite. I thought I understood possessive mothers, competitive daughters, family politics, all of it. But nothing prepared me for the reason behind what they'd done. The truth didn't come from my Mill. It didn't come from SIL. It didn't even come from the father they dragged out of whatever hole he'd been living in. It came from my husband's grandfather's lawyer. A man we hadn't spoken to since the will was executed. A man who suddenly asked to meet with us in person. A man who said, in a voice so calm it felt like he was lowering us onto a bed of nails, "There are things your grandfather asked me not to disclose unless certain events occurred. And they have occurred." We sat in his office in downtown Richmond. The blinds were half drawn, the air thick with that old paper smell. My husband looked like a ghost. I felt like one. The lawyer folded his hands, and then he told us everything. Years ago, before my husband was even born, his parents had lived in the house. Not the cute storybook version Mill always talked about. The real version. A version where my husband's father was cheating constantly, disappearing for nights, gambling money behind Mill's back. A version where Mill was drowning in debt he kept creating. And then came the part that made my skin go cold. The deed. Not the will. The deed. Because the house had originally belonged to my husband's grandmother, his grandfather's wife, who inherited it from her parents. It wasn't a family home, the way Mill always claimed. It wasn't passed down through generations of their side. It had nothing to do with them. Which meant that when my husband's father married Mill, he married into a property that was never supposed to be his to touch. But he tried anyway. The grandfather's lawyer took out a folder and slid an old document toward us. My husband read it first, then I did. It was a legal threat, filed by his father, trying to force the grandparents to sign over partial ownership of the home in anticipation of future family inheritance. He wanted the house decades ago, and Mill helped him. They weren't victims, they weren't blindsided. They were participants, but the grandparents fought it in court, quietly, privately, and won. After that, they banned my husband's father from ever living there again. They changed the deed. They secured protections so tight that the lawyer said, no one expected this to ever resurface. But here was the real dagger. Mill wasn't just helping her ex-husband now. She was protecting herself. Because if the truth came out, that she had colluded decades earlier to try to take the house, that she had lied to the court, that she had concealed assets during the divorce, she could face serious legal consequences even all these years later. And SIL had known. She'd known her whole life. The family home narrative was a cover, a script, a story they repeated so many times they started believing it themselves. But the house was never theirs. They had no claim to it. No legal standing. No right to a single brick. Yet they couldn't stand that the house, the symbol of everything they tried and failed to take, was now going to my husband. And through him, to me. The lawyer leaned back and said in a voice that made my skin prickle, "Your grandfather left the house to you because he wanted it completely out of their hands. He knew they'd try again. And he didn't trust any of them." My husband stared at the floor. I stared at the door. Everything felt different. This wasn't about jealousy. This wasn't about tradition. This wasn't even about inheritance. This was about a decades-old resentment rooted in greed, humiliation, and the fact that his family had been kept away from something they believed they were owed, something they nearly destroyed themselves trying to get. And now that the house was in my husband's name, connected to me, they saw a threat. Not because I was an outsider, but because I might find out the truth. And they were right. Because once I knew, revenge became crystal clear. And I made sure every piece of it hit exactly where it needed to. Once the truth was out, once I understood exactly what they'd been hiding, manipulating, rewriting for decades, something inside me locked into place. Not rage. Not pettiness, just certainty. They had spent years building a lie. I was going to bury it with the truth. The first step was simple: let the house finish. Every detail I had chosen, every design I'd fought for, every inch I'd poured myself into, it all came together in a way that felt like armor. Solid, unshakable. Then came the legal strike. Our lawyer filed a countersuit so detailed and devastating that even reading the first page made my husband exhale like he'd been underwater for months. It didn't just argue against their petition. It outlined Mill and SIL's history of harassment, interference, and false claims. It included the old documents the grandfather's lawyer gave us, proving prior legal attempts from the father's side. It even included notarized statements confirming the house's original lineage, his grandmother's, not theirs. But the best part? We added an official request for sanctions due to filing a knowingly baseless claim. Mill and SIL didn't see that coming. When they were served, SIL texted me in a panic. "Why would you do this to the family?" I didn't respond. Mill left 5 voicemails in one sitting, angry, defensive, self-pitying, all in the same breath. She kept saying things like, "We could have handled this privately, and you're blowing things out of proportion." No. They'd blown up their own lives when they brought in the estranged father. Speaking of him, our lawyer contacted his lawyer. Turns out, the man had no standing to claim anything. None. He backed down within 48 hours once he realized our legal team knew the full story. Mill and SIL, though, they tried to fight, and they lost, quickly, brutally. The judge dismissed their petition with prejudice, court language meaning they could never file anything like it again. But the real blow was the sanctions. They were ordered to pay our legal fees. Thousands of dollars they absolutely did not expect to lose. When they walked out of the courthouse, they didn't look at us. Mill kept her head down. SIL looked like she'd swallowed a rock. My husband held my hand so tight I felt the tremor in him, the earthquake of finally understanding who they really were. We drove home in silence. When we pulled up to the house, the sun was setting. Warm light hitting the new stone above the doorway, the one engraved with my maiden name. The stone they hated. The stone they thought they could erase. My husband stood there for a long time, staring at it. Then he said quietly, "They never wanted me, they wanted the house." And I said, "Now it's yours, and no one will ever take it from you again." But the final act of revenge wasn't the courtroom win. It wasn't the sanctions, it wasn't even exposing the truth. It was the message we sent without saying a word. Mill and SIL were cut off, completely. No visits, no holidays. No access to our future kids. No more pretending. We changed our numbers. We blocked them on everything. We told the contractor to ignore them if they ever showed up again. My husband made the call to his grandfather's lawyer personally and said, "I understand now. Thank you for protecting us." His voice cracked, but it didn't break. When we finally moved into the finished home, a home rebuilt with our hands, not their expectations, it felt like exhaling after years of holding anxiety like a fist in my chest. The first night we slept there, the house was quiet in a way that felt clean, like the ghosts had finally been pushed out. Before bed, I looked at the stone over the front door one more time. My name, our home, our life. This place wasn't built on inheritance. It was built on truth, grit, and the kind of love that survives betrayal and fights back. And if Mill ever drives past and sees that engraving, good. She'll remember exactly what she lost, and exactly who took the power back.